Today's book, What the CEO Wants You to Know. Now, the reason I chose this book was this book is about learning and speaking the language of business. And as a business and leadership coach, I understand how important it is for businesses to grow. And in fact, that's one key area that I work with my clients on. And everybody says we want to grow. And apart from that, the author, Dr. Ram Charan, such a phenomenal person, and all his books, like Group Captain said, has been fantastic. So I thought this book is very crisp. It gives us the gist of what people need to focus on to grow their business. So the crux of this book, if I were to say, three things. It talks about understanding the building blocks of money making, something that's very important for all businesses. It also tells you where should you focus on for your business growth and how you can contribute to the business growth irrespective of whatever department and whatever function that you are in. So I'd like to classify the book into different buckets and highlight each of those as part of the book. So if you were to talk about the business acumen, what does the author say about the business acumen? He says, the most successful business leaders, they never lose sight of the basics. And this ability to apply the universal laws of business is what he calls as the business acumen. He draws the example of Jack Welch, the ex-CEO of GE, and a street vendor. He says, if the street vendor, for instance, he has trouble in selling his produce, what does he do? He says they tend to cut the price so that they can increase the value for their customers. They rearrange, the display and start yelling louder, which is nothing but advertising. And they also see if they can give the better mix of between the vegetables and fruits, which is nothing but your product mix. So he says every business at the core is same irrespective of how small or how big you are. And this street vendor is constantly thinking of cash, which is a very important ingredient for any business. So what is the secret sauce, right? The secret sauce, as per this book, is, he says money making has three basic parts. What are they? The cash generation, return on assets, and growth. Now, what is return on assets? He says it's nothing but the combination of velocity and the margin. So to these three ingredients, he says, you add the customers, and that becomes the core of any business. What is velocity? Velocity describes the idea of speed, the turnover or the movement. So if you were to look at the raw materials, by the time it gets processed into the factory and turns into finished goods and moving to the customer, how quick or fast is this rate? And that is what is velocity. So the inventory turnover, like we call it in finance parlance, is also referred to as velocity, and faster the velocity, higher the returns for any business. Then he focuses on the important ingredient of cash. So he says when a company can't generate enough cash, what does it tend to do? It tends to borrow. But if they borrow heavily and do not correct the problem, they have trouble in repaying the loans, and therefore companies tend to become bankrupt. So think in your business. Does your business generate enough cash? And how is the cash being utilized in your business? So what is cash generation? Cash generation is nothing but the difference between your cash in and cash out within a certain period of time. Is your company generating sufficient cash? Why is it generating? How much is it generating? Now, these are questions he wants you to think about in your business. Even if you're in a large company, if you're heading a particular division, is your division consuming cash or generating cash? He gives a nice example of Walmart. He says Walmart, in their inventory, he says the toilet paper that's being stored is an excellent use of shelf space of Walmart because it has high velocity. And they also make profits on each toilet paper that's being sold. Pushing for sales, which many companies tend to do. Pushing for sales does not necessarily mean your business is doing well. Because is it generating cash? Are you getting sufficient margins? Those are some very important factors. So he says, know the how and the why of cash generation. If your productivity is being continuously improved, then the margins and the cash get better and cash gets generated. So he advises to focus more on the productivity. So if the margin is improving and the cash is also growing, he says that's when you think of developing a new product or buy another company or expand into newer territories. From cash, let's look at customer. What does he have to say about customers? He says CEOs with good business acumen have a close connection with their customers. Why is that? Because he says by being directly connected to the customer, it helps them to identify specific areas of improvement. He gives a nice example of Sears, which is a clothing company for women in the US. The CEO had lost touch with the customers and the business started to sink. They were not aware of the latest trends and the customer behavior. So their new CEO, Arthur Martinez, he had come and then he figured out why women weren't really preferring their clothing, and he started to redesign and he expanded the range of offerings for the customers. And this paid off for the business, both the income grew and the profitability also grew. Another very interesting thing he says, do you know the difference between consumer and customer? What is the difference? He gives a nice example illustrating this about Colgate-Palmolive. He says, whenever they develop a new product, they try to understand the needs and the wants of the consumer because they are the ones who are consuming it. But many of its processes, for example, logistics, the discounts, the merchandising, the shelving and all of that is geared towards their customers like Walmart. Customers, end of the day, buy the trustworthiness, and that is what is something very important. And when you don't get the margins that you want, talk to your customers and understand what is missing, work on it and offer your customers, which enhances the growth and betters the margin. What does he have to say about growth? He says, having no growth in this world that's growing every day, your business would lag. So he talks about shareholders' value added for judging how well your business is doing. So what is the shareholders' value add? It's nothing but your cash, your margins, the velocity, return on assets, and the growth. And growth has to be profitable and sustainable. He gives an example of a company that's been growing in sales, which is great, but the margins were dipping. So leaders need to be focused on consistent, predictable, and profitable growth. He also talks about another interesting thing called adjacencies. What is that? He gives the example of Nike. He says Nike, they work on, apart from selling the shoes, which is what they are known for, they also sell athletic apparel, right? Which is related to the core business. So that's, he calls as adjacencies. He also says it's important for you to understand the company's total business. So he says, ask questions, things like, what were your company's sales during last year? Is your company actually growing? Is the growth flat, declining, or how is it? What is your company's profit margin? And again, is it growing or declining? How does it compare with your competitors and other industries? What is your company's return on assets? And is your company gaining or losing to competition? So he says, understand all of this for you to get a holistic picture of your companies. Another important thing he talks about is business priorities. And he says the smart CEOs always have 3 to 5 top business priorities which help in money making. So to give an example, he says, supposing you're managing 3 or 4 different product lines, he says, do you know which one is actually making money, which one is consuming or generating cash, and which one is what your customers want? So look through, ask questions like, is it design? Is it what the customers like? Is it giving you a good margin? Is it preferred over competition? CEOs should have clear business priorities for the business to keep growing. Then he talks about wealth. Wealth is more than money making. And that's where he introduces the concept of the price earnings ratio, which is the PE multiple. And he says how much profit the company makes for each share stock is what is your PE. So PE, supposing there's a PE of 7, it means for every dollar of earnings per share of your business, your stock is worth 7 times more. So obviously higher the PE, higher the wealth created for your shareholders. All the employees in GE, he says, they know that if they do not contribute to money making, GE is not the place for them to work. So he urges everybody to think on how can you contribute to the money making of your business. And by creating this wealth, it's not just the shareholders who are benefited, but also the employees get benefited. Then he touches upon the people aspect. And very interesting things he said. He says a leader harnesses the efforts of the people, expands their personal capacity and synchronizes them so that the business gets the desired results. By linking people's actions and the decisions is right priority, and it's important to have right people in the right job. Now, when there are differences of opinion, he says go ahead and confront people, because that dealing with it, any kind of mismatch that you may have, then releases the energy that has been coming in the way. He also talks about an important aspect, which he says people who do well in a job, they also need attention, and that's where he says coaching is something very important, because we think the people who are star performers don't need coaching, but it is the other way around. Let me also give you the example of the sports world. Even the topmost sports professionals tend to work with a coach. So why should it be any different in a corporate world or a business, right? So that's what he highlights. And he says, by coaching your team members, you're helping them to identify their blind spots and helping them to do things better. Feedback needs to be honest and direct. Then he moves on to talk about dwells into little more into coaching, where he says leaders don't have to just coach on the behavioral skills, but they also need to coach about the business aspect. There could be some people who are probably not strong enough to say a no, or they may lack courage, or they may not be challenging, and that's where a leader pitches in and behaves as a coach, or gets them to work with a coach to identify their blind spots and achieve the desired results. So he says sometimes in large organizations, when there is a big group of people, decision making is slow. So he gives the example of Walmart again, where Sam Walton, the founder, had introduced something called social operating mechanism. And he says that deserves a Nobel Prize in business if there's something like that. And what they do is they just tend to meet regularly and they discuss comparing with competitors on their pricing strategy, the merchandising, consumer behavior and trends, the best practices and stuff like that, which he says is so important, because he says from a 50,000 foot level, it takes them to the 50 foot, to the ground reality, and that's what helps the business to grow. And the designing this SOM, that is the SOM, the social operating mechanism, it's the leadership task, not the HR's duty. So what and how do you go about? He says CEOs, if they have to deliver, they have to master both the business side and managing the people as well. So he gives a nice example of EDS, where how they went about managing. The new CEO actually deep dived, he went to the root cause, understood what the issues were, and then he addressed them, had his business priorities in place, which was like to grow the sales, bring down the costs, increase the margins, right? And most importantly, they wanted to focus on better client service. So doing stuff like this, having the right actions in place, having a lot of transparency within the team and discussing the results and making people accountable, right? That is very important, he says. And he concludes very interestingly to say, so what is the role that you play? What role can you play in the money making for your business? Expand your perspective from just a functional or a departmental view to have a holistic picture of the entire business. And what are the business priorities? Know the business priorities that will actually make you the money. Where is the Moolah? That's my book. So get to know where the money is. So in conclusion, if I were to say the top 3 secret mantras of this book, the first thing is the elements of money making. That's cash generation, margin, velocity, returns, growth, customers, and the relationship between all of these. The second thing, the highest business priorities should be customer satisfaction, because that leads to improved satisfaction, improves your velocity, margins, which in turn results in better sales, earnings, and growth of the business. And the third thing that stood out for me is right people in the right job. By synchronizing their efforts, channelizing their energy, and linking it with business priorities is what will make the difference to the business and lead the business to growth. So my friends, that is the gist of the book.